Welcome everybody to this event, and thanks very much to Lachlan McCall and to the young economists of the ACT for inviting me to come along and speak to you this evening. I'm slightly overwhelmed with the number of people that I believe have registered for this, but that's absolutely great. And it's true that modern monetary theory has been in the news for obvious reasons a lot recently. Before we get going, let me just say that what I intend to do is to give you, to the best of my ability, it's going to be something of a caricature, of course, because we're talking about 25 to 30 years of work for a large number of very talented economists. But I want to give you a background in modern monetary theory, which I think everybody ought to have who's working as an economist. I'm not going to try and convert you to modern monetary theory. If you are going to be critical of modern monetary theory and MMT economists, then I think you at least need to know the basics about how they think about the world and the techniques which underlie their economic analysis and the policy prescriptions that they might make. And let me just say before I get started that if you do find what I'm going to be talking about this evening, which is an alternative frame for thinking about macroeconomics, shocking, if your instinctive reaction is to be dismissive, to get angry, or even to laugh at some of it, then that's okay. That's exactly the way I felt when I should have thought about this before. Somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, I first came across modern monetary theory. It didn't make me angry, but I was dismissive because it's a very different way of thinking about macroeconomics and the role of the government and the government's budget in our economy to what I'd been using. I had a very similar economics training to the one that you would have had, most of you much more recently than mine, in the early 1980s. I started training bankers and teaching in various aspects of economics in the mid-1980s. And it wasn't until the early 2000s that I met MMT. My initial reaction was to go away and try and prove that they were wrong. And I suppose that's what I tried to do from about 2003 onwards. But annoyingly for me, at least initially, I couldn't find anything wrong with the logic that MMT economists like Professor Bill Mitchell in Australia and the US, Professor Stephanie Kelton and Randall Wray, and the fund manager Warren Mosler, and many others around the world were using. And even more annoyingly for me at the time, they seem to keep getting a lot of questions about macroeconomics right. They seem to have been right about the Eurozone. They were right about Bill Clinton's surpluses disappearing in the early 2000s. The big thing that they got right in the mid-2000s, they didn't just predict it was going to happen, but they also predicted pretty much what would happen, was the global financial crisis in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007. These people were saying that the set of macroeconomic balances, or perhaps we should say imbalances, in the US economy was developing in a way which was likely to lead to an endogenously driven financial crisis, which would plunge the US into a deep and prolonged recession and have major consequences for the global economy. And there were other things they were right about too. And I guess I started calling myself an MMT economist in September 2008, because by that time I just gave up, and I read everything that I could find that those people and their colleagues had written about, and other economists who, from previous generations, that modern monetary theorists had built on the work of, like Hyman Minsky and Wynne Godley and Abba Lerner and others had written about. And I'm certainly now an MMT economist, but I'm not one of the people that developed modern monetary theory. I have a job teaching economics at the University of Adelaide. I'm not a leading researcher. I don't have the authority to be able to say that I'm speaking on behalf of modern monetary theory or MMT economists, but I do think I can talk to you about, as the title just says, what I think every economist should know, and that's what I'm going to try and do. So what is modern monetary theory? You hear some people, and I believe the former governor of the Bank of England, I'm a senior, Mervyn Lees, said this only today. It's not modern, it's not monetary, and it's not a theory. He said, well, if you want to say that, fine, I'm not going to argue with you. It's not predominantly about monetary policy, it is about the monetary system. If you want to say it's not a theory because you see it as purely descriptive of how monetary systems work, and if by the time I finish you think I've not said anything that anybody could possibly contend with, and if you think I haven't made any simplifying assumptions, then I think you're wrong, but I'm not going to argue with you about it. If you don't want to use the word theory, that's fine. And if you want to say it's not modern, well, in a sense, you're right. MMT has long historical roots. It is possible to argue that the various elements of modern monetary theory have been put together and applied by the economists I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, in a way which is fundamentally different to how they've been applied previously. But that word modern in modern monetary theory is really a reference to something in the first chapter of Keynes' treatise on money, which was published way back in 1930, where Keynes described what modern money is and said that the way he defined modern money, the way we're going to define modern money in a moment, is actually the correct description of how money has worked for, well, he said, at least 4,000 years. These days, we say more than 5,000 years. But modern monetary theory, however you think about the title, it's just a brand name. It's a frame or a lens which people like me use to understand macroeconomic issues. As I've just said, it's an approach to macroeconomics which has been developed by the people I was just talking about and some others over the past 25 or 30 years, with long historical roots, but in its modern form, based on a very detailed nitty-gritty analysis of how monetary systems actually work, getting down to the level of balance sheets and monetary operations and reserve accounting. It is mainly descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's neither left-wing nor right-wing. It's just a way of understanding the world, but it does have implications for the set of policy options which are available to governments, and particularly governments in monetary systems like our own. I think when we teach people economics, we get money wrong right from the very beginning, or at least we very often do. So when you did your first economics class, Econ 101, we might call it, you probably will have been exposed to a story where money emerged out of barter. There was a pre-existing barter system with the double coincidence of wants problem and other transaction costs, and a commodity, perhaps a precious metal like gold, emerged from that barter system as a mechanism for eliminating those transaction costs and allowing trade to develop and allowing economies to grow more efficiently over time. The thing is, archaeologists and anthropologists and monetary historians who have written about the development of money thousands of years ago, although they don't agree on very much, do agree on one thing, which is that money didn't emerge from a pre-existing barter system anywhere in the world, even once. And it's misleading to think about money as a commodity. Instead, money is, and always has been, an IOU of one kind or another. As Hyman Minsky, who, as I said, was one of the forerunners of modern monetary theory, if not a grandfather of MMT, a sort of favourite uncle. As he said, anyone can create money. The problem lies in getting it accepted. Well, anybody can create an IOU. I could write an IOU for $50. I could promise to pay you on demand the sum of $50. I could sign it. That would be a financial liability for me. If you owned it, it would be a financial asset for you, a claim that you had on me. And if claims on me, if my IOUs were generally accepted across the community as being safe, then you might be able to spend that IOU. You might be able to use it in exchange for goods and services. Of course, that's unlikely to be the case in reality. And when we think about money in reality, most of us, we're thinking about what's in our bank accounts, what's in our bank deposits. But the deposit that you have at the ANZ or at People's Choice Credit Union or whatever authorised deposit-taking institution you deal with is just an IOU. It's the IOU that that institution has to you. It's a financial liability of that institution. Now, why do we regard our deposits with these institutions as money? Because we have a guarantee, or if it's for wholesale sums, a virtual guarantee at least. We're very confident that we can convert those IOUs, those promises to pay, into the government's money, into the state money, on demand and at par. The government's money or the state's money includes, of course, physical currency, but it also includes, I'm having problems with my screen, sorry, this is going to disrupt things a little bit if I don't put it right. It also includes the exchange settlement account balances that the banks and other authorised deposit-taking institutions have at the government central bank, at the RBA. In other words, the government's money is what we sometimes call the monetary base. Now, base money can be spent into circulation by the government or its central bank, or lent into circulation by the government or its central bank, but that's where it comes from. It comes from the currency issuer. And that base money is that which is necessary to pay taxes. Taxes guarantee a demand for a currency in a modern monetary system. If we go back to the 19th century and look at how currency was introduced into societies which had previously not been monetary societies by colonial powers, the way this worked in general was that those colonial powers would want to provision themselves. They'd want people locally to work for them, and they'd want to do this without enslaving those people. In order for this to be possible, they needed to create a demand for their money, for the colonial powers' money locally. And the way you do this is you impose a tax on people. You'd say to people, you need to pay us a tax if you don't want to be imprisoned or punished in some other way. And this tax has to be paid using money with Queen Victoria's head on. Of course, they haven't got any money with Queen Victoria's head on. How are they going to be able to pay their taxes to you? Well, they've either got to come and work for you, which was the whole point of it in the first place from your perspective, or else they've got to provide services or sell goods for those people that are working for you. So taxation was important for the introduction of money into pre-monetary societies in the first place. As I said, we've got stories about this from colonial times, but this was true even 5,000 years ago, when money when something resembling modern money was first developed initially in what is now the Iraqi desert, but in a number of places around the world. Other monies, money not issued by the government or the central bank, are accepted based on a guarantee they can be converted into that government money at par, and that government money is that which is necessary to pay taxes. You might think you're paying your taxes to the federal government, to the ATO, using funds in your bank account, but of course what is happening is that your bank is making the payment for you using funds in its exchange settlement account at the RBA. In other words, using government money, government issued money. Now, these currencies have sometimes been fixed against commodities like gold or they've been fixed against foreign currencies when we've been on fixed exchange rate systems. But even under those circumstances, as Keynes explained in chapter 1 of his treatise on money, the rules of the game have been set by governmental institutions and from time to time changed by those governmental institutions too. So money didn't emerge from barter. Money wasn't invented in the private sector. Money is an IOU. At the top of the monetary hierarchy is the government's money. We can use the government's money. Well, of course we can, to discharge our legal obligations, but also, most importantly, in order to make payments to the government itself. Money is that which is necessary to pay taxes. Taxation played an important role in the emergence of money and markets in the first place. Now, why did I go back to that? Because it's important. Because the story that we tell about money influences the way we think about the monetary system and the role of the government in the economy, not just in our first year economics course, but throughout our economics training and beyond. Governments that are currency issuers are in a different position to everybody else. You and I, before we can spend dollars, have to obtain those dollars from somewhere. We've got to go and earn them, or if we don't earn them, then we can run down our past savings, or we can borrow them. But if we borrow them, we run up a debt. And of course, as far as you and I are concerned, we can't print money. So when we run up a debt, we run the risk of getting into financial distress and potentially insolvency in the future, or at least we need to earn more than we're spending in the future in order to pay back that debt. But currency issuers are in a different position to everybody else. That story that I was just telling a moment ago was a story where the government spent currency into circulation and then taxed some of that currency back out of circulation again. And Stephanie Kelton, when she makes a distinction between currency users like you and me, like the state government of South Australia or Victoria or New South Wales, like the government of Greece, like Virgin Blue, they're all currency users. When you make a distinction between currency users and currency issuers, it has implications for the logical way you describe spending by currency issuers and taxation. So every dollar that a currency issuing government like our government spends is a new dollar. Every dollar that the government spends is a contribution towards the net financial assets of the private sector. If we're going to use language a little bit loosely, then every dollar that the government spends is a contribution to the net money supply. They then tax some of those dollars back out of circulation again, and they can choose to borrow dollars back out of circulation as well. Governments like our own, as I'm going to say a little bit later, choose to issue treasury bonds or Commonwealth government debt securities. They're not forced to do so. Those bonds play an important role in our economy, but neither bond issuance nor taxation can be thought of, strictly speaking, as funding government spending, because the government spends the dollars into circulation first, and then they tax some of those dollars back out of circulation, and they may borrow others. When you talk about governments like our own raising dollars through taxation or borrowing in order to spend, you've got the cart before the horse. You've logically got the spending and the taxation the wrong way around. Currency issuers do not tax and borrow before they spend. Currency issuers spend before they can tax and borrow. You can't tax dollars out of circulation or borrow dollars out of circulation before the government's either spent them into circulation or the RBA's lent them into circulation. They have to have come from somewhere. That doesn't mean that taxes don't have an important macroeconomic role beyond creating a demand for the currency when it's first introduced. Of course, taxes have an important macroeconomic role, but that's not to pay for anything, at least not at the federal level. Taxes reduce the ability of the private sector to spend on goods and services, and so create room within the productive capacity of our economy for the government to spend without that spending being inflationary. Taxes have that key macroeconomic role to ensure that total spending remains below the productive capacity of the economy so that competition between the government sector and the private sector for goods and services doesn't create generalized scarcity and accelerating inflation. That, of course, does not mean that the government has to balance its budget over time. It doesn't mean that tax receipts and government expenditure have to be equal to each other. And as we're going to see, that's not normally been the case in the past. It's normal for governments to run deficits. It's normal for the non-government part of our monetary system to be in surplus. The governments that have the greatest possible policy space as far as fiscal policy is concerned, as far as the use of the power of the public purse to maintain non-inflationary full employment is concerned, are monetary sovereign currency issues. And we're going to come to those institutions in a moment. And it's those institutions, technically, which are the ones for whom borrowing operations are optional, and when they are used are best thought of as a tool of monetary policy, not fiscal policy. The government does not borrow to fund its spending if it is a monetary sovereign government. It doesn't have to do that. It's a currency issuer. Now, monetary sovereignty is a continuum. So it's a bit misleading and oversimplistic to talk about governments being monetary sovereign governments or not, but we are going to simplify here, and we're going to say you're fully monetary sovereign if you issue your own currency and you collect taxes in that currency. And of course that's true of the Australian Commonwealth government, of our federal government. If you have a floating exchange rate, if you don't fix your currency to a foreign currency or a commodity, if you're not on a gold standard. Of course, in the case of Australia, we've only had a floating exchange rate since 1983. If you have a fixed exchange rate, then you're entering into a commitment to exchange your currency for a foreign currency at a fixed rate on demand in order to defend that fixed exchange rate target. And you can run out of foreign currency. You are not an issuer of foreign currency, so you don't have complete monetary sovereignty. To have full monetary sovereignty, you should also have, as a government, no significant foreign currency denominated debt. If you, like Argentina, have significant US dollar denominated debt, then again, you're faced with a financial constraint because, of course, you don't issue the US dollar. In the case of Australia, we are a currency issuer. We have a floating exchange rate. Our government has no significant foreign currency denominated debt. We are a full monetary sovereign. The same thing is true of New Zealand. The same thing is true of Japan. The same thing is true of the UK. The same thing is true of the USA or Canada or a variety of other countries. It's difficult to attain full monetary sovereignty if you are a small, low-income economy dependent on imported necessities, where those necessities are priced in foreign currency, because you then are faced with a fear of floating. Moving to a floating exchange rate and the potential for severe depreciation to put major upward pressure on the domestic currency prices of those basic necessities means it's difficult for you to achieve the status of a full monetary sovereign. If you're an MMT economist like me, you'd say that over time you should be addressing those vulnerabilities, because we believe that all countries should move over time, almost all countries anyway, towards being monetary sovereign economies. Okay, well, if you are a monetary sovereign economy, then these first two axioms apply to you, and actually the second axiom and the identity, which is the third point that I've made on this slide, apply to everybody. If you're a full monetary sovereign, you face no purely financial budget constraints. I'm sorry if that's shocking, but it's true. It's just a fact. The Australian Commonwealth government is never going to run out of Australian dollars. The US government is never going to run out of US dollars. The British government is never going to run out of pounds. The Japanese government, well, it may have the world's highest level of government debt relative to the size of its economy, 6 times as much government debt as in Australia by some measures, but they're never going to run out of Japanese yen. However, this is not a recipe for limitless spending, and it doesn't mean you don't have to tax people, because all economies face real resource constraints. Of course, the production possibility frontier applies to everybody. We have a limited stock of labour and skills and capital equipment and technology and natural resources and institutional capacity. And if total spending in our economy by the private sector and the public sector and the rest of the world, for that matter, on what we produce, pushes us beyond the productive capacity of the economy, then potentially that's going to drive accelerating inflation. MMT does not argue that there are no constraints on spending in an economy or that we've got limitless resources. MMT instead focuses on that inflation constraint when assessing fiscal policy proposals, because if you are a monetary sovereign government, that's the only constraint that you face. And thirdly, the accounting identity we're going to come to, sectoral balances sum to zero. What does that mean? It means if the non-government sector within our monetary system desires to run a surplus, the only way that's going to be possible is for the government to run a deficit. And it's normal for governments like the Australian government, the US government, the UK government, the Japanese government to run a deficit. These governments have normally run fiscal deficits in the past, and they will in the future, basically because the rest of the monetary system, if we ignore the rest of the world for the moment, the private sector normally wants to run a surplus. Now, these ideas that we're going to go through over the next few minutes, to use a quote from Keynes and from the general theory, I'm sorry if I'm expressing them very laboriously, but they're actually quite simple ideas. And once you understand them, they're obvious. So what have we said so far? We've said you shouldn't be obsessed with trying to balance your budget or run a budget surplus if you're a government. If there's no significant inflation risk, and if you've got a significant level of unemployment and underemployment, then actually you're not living up to your means, even if you're running a fiscal deficit. If there are no significant inflationary pressures in the economy and you're a monetary sovereign, you're unconstrained as far as fiscal policy is concerned, or at least not living up to your constraint. Now, why, in my view, do we get so much of this wrong? Why do journalists often use the wrong narrative when thinking about public finance? Why do politicians often use the wrong narrative? And why is it so attractive for members of the public to think about the government as though it faces the same budget constraints as the rest of us? In other words, to ignore the distinction between a currency issuer and a currency user. It's basically because we buy into a misleading story about money and public finance. And this diagram from an American MMT economist who used to be an architect called J.D. Alt is useful to look at when thinking about how we're misled. I'm not saying that economists necessarily think in this way, but what I am saying is that the way economists discuss fiscal policy very often encourages politicians and journalists and members of the public to think along these lines. Well, what are these lines? FG stands for the federal government. And according to this story, the federal government needs to raise taxes from the private sector, or to borrow from the private sector, or to borrow from the rest of the world before it can spend. The trouble is, of course, it's bleeding the private sector dry. The private sector doesn't have very much money in the first place. The government's taking this money in taxes. And the other problem, of course, is the government having used this money to fund a whole series of entitlements and wasted the money maybe in a variety of more or less imaginative ways on different forms of discretionary spending. It then has to repay not only what it's borrowing, but also the interest on what it's borrowing. Once it's bled the private sector dry, then how's it going to fund its spending? And if China refuses to lend the government any more money, how is the government going to fund its spending? The government, surely, like you or I, at some point is going to be faced with a fiscal crisis, and we're going to have terrible austerity, or well, I don't know what's supposed to happen. Now, of course, this is misleading. The government is the currency issuer to the extent that the private sector is paying taxes to the government. It's actually returning to the government something which has come from the government in the first place, which is the Australian dollar. And the Australian government and the Reserve Bank are the monopoly issuers of Australian dollars. So we don't rely on China to lend us Australian dollars. This is a misleading story about public finance. Instead, to quote from the title of a 1947 paper in the American Economic Review by Aber Lerner, money is a creature of the state. Our federal government is a currency issuer. Every dollar the government spends into our monetary system is a new dollar. This spending, of course, provides a range of public goods and services and provides the economic and social infrastructure on which our economy sits and on which profitable businesses that we might work for or invest in rely. The government can issue, and in recent decades has issued treasury bonds, roughly speaking, to match the difference between its level of spending and the amount of taxation that it's taking back out of the system again. Remember what the macroeconomic role of taxation is: to limit the ability of the private sector to spend in order to limit inflationary pressures in the economy. I'm not saying, by the way, if inflation starts to creep up, the only way of dealing with inflationary pressures is to raise taxes. I'm not saying that at all, but the fundamental macroeconomic function of taxation for a monetary sovereign government is nonetheless to limit inflationary pressures in the economy. Why auction treasury bonds to approximately match the difference between government spending and taxation? Well, the current system was introduced in 1982 in Australia, and if you go onto the AOFM site, the Australian Office of Financial Management site, and you look at a document there which discusses the history of Treasury Board auctions, you'll see that at the time, the reason for moving to this system was that deficit spending not matched by Treasury bill issuance was flooding the banking system with reserves, with exchange settlement account funds. And at least up until the 18th of March, 2020, the way in which the RBA controlled the cash rate, the overnight interest rate on our money market, was to ensure that bank exchange settlement accounts were not flooded with funds. So in order to defend the RBA's interest rate target in 1982, we moved to a system for auctioning treasury bonds, where those treasury bond auctions drained excess reserves from the banking system and helped the RBA maintain its target for the cash rate. Of course, this changed after the 18th of March because the Reserve Bank is now buying back treasury bonds more quickly than they're being auctioned by the AOFM at the moment, and so deliberately flooding the banking system with reserves. But the purpose for issuing government debt to approximately match the fiscal deficit has been to defend interest rates. You could provide other reasons too, providing attractive assets for fund managers, including the people managing your superannuation fund, providing benchmark default risk-free interest rates across the yield curve, but not because the government needs to issue those bonds in order to fund its spending. When we've got the RBA buying the bonds back again, as they are at the moment, that's obviously not the case. What about interest payments on these bonds? Well, like all other federal government spending, interest payments on government bonds are new dollars going into the system. They're mildly stimulative, and you can see them as a form of welfare spending to savers, if you like. They are providing interest payments on default risk-free assets which fund managers and other savers, including foreign investors, are choosing to hold. Having said all that, then, that leads us to some simple facts about federal governments or central governments in monetary systems like our own. A solvency crisis relating to debts and deficits is literally impossible. In our monetary system, it is literally impossible for the Australian Commonwealth Government to run out of Australian dollars. Aha, you're thinking, Zimbabwe, hyperinflation. Well, I won't get into the Zimbabwe story at the moment, which at least initially has a lot more to do with a collapse in supply than increasing demand. But yes, 100%, I agree. The constraint on fiscal decisions taken by the government is and should always be seen as inflation risk, never solvency risk. Government net debt is non-government net financial assets. The government's debt I prefer to refer to as the net money supply. It is money which is available to us in the non-government part of our monetary system, which we haven't had to borrow into existence. That's all it is. Or to put it another way, it's dollars that the government spent into the system and not yet taxed back out of the system again. So, sure, fiscal deficits matter, but not for the reasons many imagine. If your deficits are too high, given the behavior of the private sector and the rest of the world in our economy, then it could be inflationary. On the other hand, if your deficits are too low, then you're going to be living somewhere inside your production possibility frontier when you don't need to. You're going to be having unemployment and underemployment, which you could afford if you could only get the institutional setup right to do so in a way which is non-inflationary. You could afford to eliminate. And what's more, historically, and this is just a simple fact, deficits are the norm. They're not the exception. When people talk about returning the budget to surplus, we've hardly ever been in surplus. And in the case of countries like the US, you could almost take the word hardly out there. Moreover, not only is it not the case that fiscal deficits are unsustainable, if you don't have, I haven't said trade surplus, but since you're economists, let's get it technically right. If you don't have a current account surplus, if you don't have a persistent current account surplus, it's a fiscal surplus, which is unsustainable because surpluses and deficits across our monetary system cancel out. And if you have balanced trade, if you have a zero current account balance, or worse still, if you have a current account deficit, and the government is running a fiscal surplus, that means the private sector is going to be in deficit. That tends to go with a build-up of private sector gross debt relative to GDP, which in the case of Australia tends to be, at least in recent decades, household debt. And you move towards a more fragile financial system and you encourage asset bubbles in the stock market or the property market or both. And then it's good to start talking about Hyman Minsky and his financial fragility hypothesis. If you want the private sector to be in surplus, which is where it ought to be, then if you don't have a current account surplus on your balance of payments, you need the government to be running deficits. Just to rehash quickly, if you are a non-monetary sovereign government, like Greece, and if you could imagine Greece being close to full employment, then you'd be faced with both financial and real constraints. Sure, there'd be real constraints on what the government was doing, because if you pump more demand into an economy where there's already excess demand, of course, you expect to see accelerating inflation under those circumstances. But you couldn't describe Greece, or let's pick up other examples like Spain or Italy or Portugal. You couldn't describe them as being anywhere near full employment over the last 10 years, post-global financial crisis. But of course, they don't have their own currencies. They're not monetary sovereign governments. For them, the currency issuer is the European Central Bank. That's not their national central bank, and they're not guaranteed to have the support permanently of the European Central Bank to ensure that they're not faced with default risk. Consequently, and particularly because down the years, they have been under pressure to keep their budget deficits below 3% of GDP, they're faced with a financial constraint which does not apply to monetary sovereign governments and didn't apply to them before they were part of the Eurozone. If you are a monetary sovereign government like the Australian government, of course you have a real constraint. Any fiscal program that you consider implementing, any fiscal program that a political party takes to a federal election should be assessed based not on its implications for the government budget per se, but on its implications for inflationary pressures in the economy. And if you are far from full employment, and if there are no significant inflationary pressures in the economy, you're basically unconstrained. The issue should not be government solvency. The issue should be inflationary pressures. When you get further into MMT and you start looking at macroeconomic modelling by MMT economists, then you start to use something which is called stock flow consistent monetary economics, or stock flow consistent macroeconomics, which was originally developed by another one of the forerunners of MMT, who towards the end of his life did a lot of work at the Levy Institute with MMT economists, Wynne Godley. And Wynne Godley and other forerunners of MMT like Hyman Minsky down the years have pointed out, well, like I did at the beginning, that money did not emerge in a previous existing barter system, and that therefore it's not appropriate to treat the economy as though it's a stable general equilibrium system. Even in modern dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, when money and financial institutions and markets are included in those models, they can never be included in the models in a realistic way, because the roots of those models go all the way back to the Walrasian general equilibrium model, which is essentially a barter model. No wonder those models don't allow you to anticipate or predict or deal well with the consequences of financial crises like the global financial crisis. They're not set up to identify vulnerabilities like that. Instead, it's better to think of the economy as a set of interconnected and shifting balance sheets, evolving over time, always in ways which can potentially become unsustainable. And as I said, there's liable to be a build-up of unsustainable balance sheets within the private sector in an economy which is not running trade surpluses if the government budget is either in surplus or approximately balanced. You need to get the accounting right within these models, and that's something that Wynne Godley was a pioneer of doing. Of course, for one person, one economic agent to receive income, somebody else must be spending. So if you're receiving dollars from me as income, that's income for you, it's spending for me. But those dollars must have come from somewhere. That has implications for my balance sheet. Where did I find those dollars? If I borrowed them from a bank, that has implications for the bank's balance sheet too. And when you receive these dollars as your income, if you save them, how do you save them? In what form? Do they go directly into the banking system, or do you buy shares from somebody else before the dollars go into the banking system? Again, it has implications for balance sheets, and we need to try and map out what those implications are over time. And we need to take into account that, as I've said, across our monetary system as a whole, surpluses and deficits have to cancel out. So surpluses in one part of the monetary system require deficits elsewhere. If the private sector needs and wants to run surpluses to net save, to accumulate net financial assets over time, well, some other part of our monetary system has to be in deficit. If it's not the rest of the world, if we're not running a current account surplus on our balance of payments, it has to be the government. There's nowhere else those surpluses can come from. You have to get the accounting right. As I said, this is something that Wynne Godley pioneered. Not because that's going to tell you what's going to happen, because we live in a complex and highly uncertain economy, but at least to appreciate trends which are likely to be unsustainable, and to be able to identify forecasts, as people like Godley did before the global financial crisis, that institutions like the US Treasury were making, and for that matter, the IMF and the World Bank, which seemed to be based on implausible projections about what's likely to happen to private balance sheets. Simplifying a great deal and aggregating enormously, and you lose a lot of richness when you do this. We get to something that you can discuss with first-year students, or that it's easy to discuss with the general public or with journalists, which again was pioneered by Wynne Godley, but it's really just based on simple national income accounting, the sectoral balances approach to macroeconomics. This is stock flow consistent macroeconomics at its most basic, aggregated level. Sometimes we divide the monetary system up into 5 or 6 sectors, but at its simplest level, we use 3 sectors. We talk about the domestic private sector, the general government sector, and the rest of the world, or the foreign sector. And as I've said, surpluses and deficits across our monetary system have to cancel out. Another way of saying for every net borrower, there has to be a net lender, really. So the private sector financial balance and the government financial balance and the foreign financial balance have to sum to zero. This is just an accounting identity at the moment. We're not saying anything about cause and effect, but this, what's on this particular slide, has no theoretical content. It's not something you can take issue with. It's just an accounting fact. The foreign sector financial balance is the negative of our current account balance. So if we were looking at the balance of payments, it would be the capital and financial account on Australia's balance of payments. But if the foreign sector is in surplus, it means we're running a current account deficit. And of course, that was the case in Australia continuously between 1974 and last year. We just temporarily had a very small current account surplus, which is likely to be reversed during the current crisis. If you want me to use a little bit of first year notation or algebra, we can do that too. The private sector financial balance, that's the net acquisition of financial assets by the Australian private sector. That's the difference between private sector saving and private sector investment. The government balance, well, strictly speaking, it should be taxes and other receipts of the general government sector minus government spending. And of course, you're taking transfers out of there. And strictly speaking, we ought to be including government spending on interest payments here too. And over here, well, I've got imports minus exports, but it's not the trade deficit, it's the current account deficit that we're looking at here. That's the foreign sector financial balance on our monetary system. That what the foreign sector is net lending to us over any given period of time. Now, the important point that I've made more than once already is that all sectors cannot be in surplus at the same time. So, forget the foreign sector at the moment. Actually, if we're running a current account deficit, it just reinforces what I'm about to say. If healthy private sector balance sheets require the private sector to be running financial surpluses over time, that means they require the government to run financial deficits. Something else we can say with reference to this slide. If you want to hold the economy at the full employment level of GDP, now you can influence the net savings desires of the private sector if you're the government. Of course you can in a variety of ways, but you can't determine them. They're outside your control. They're determined largely endogenously within the private sector. And of course, you can influence your trade balance, your current account balance as well, but you can't determine it. It's outside of your control. So the desire that the rest of the world has to net save on your monetary system over time is not something that the government can control. What does that tell us? It tells us that the government balance consistent with full employment will evolve over time, which is to a considerable extent outside the control of the government. A particular level of government balance, a particular fiscal deficit will be appropriate given the behaviour of the other two sectors and the institutional structure of the economy. It will be consistent with full employment. Now, as I've said, that's not to say that the government can't influence these things, but they can't determine them. And of course, we're all aware, and I'm going to be showing you in some charts in a moment, the extent to which this is true. We're all aware that to a considerable extent, the fiscal balance is determined endogenously within the economy. If we have a major recession or an economic crisis like we do at the moment, of course, government expenditure on transfers automatically increases and tax receipts crash. Without the government deliberately doing anything at all, the government budget will go towards deficit under those circumstances. The point that people like me make is there's nothing to be scared of as far as government deficits are concerned. And indeed, that under these circumstances, you can have good government deficits that support the economy, that allow the private sector to move towards healthier balance sheets to meet its net savings desires. Or you can have what you might regard as bad government budget deficits. You can have a government attempting to stay close to balancing its budget, like those non-monetary sovereign economies in the Eurozone after the global financial crisis, when they were trying to obey the terms of the Stability and Growth Pact. And the government deficit is going to skyrocket under those circumstances anyway, but this time it's not going to be planned. It's not going to support the economy close to full employment. It's going to be the result of collapsing private sector incomes and so collapsing tax receipts. Okay, well, let's have a look at some pictures. This picture for the USA, the sectoral balances chart, has been described by the chief economist of Goldman Sachs, no less, as the most important chart in the world. Why is it important? I've got two different ways of presenting the same information here. Choose whichever one you prefer. It makes the point, which we've already made, that surpluses and deficits have to cancel out over time. If you look at sectoral balances as far as the US is concerned, we can see the foreign sector in recent times has always been in surplus. That's the same thing as saying US has run current account deficits continuously for more or less continuously for a long time now. But it's the other two sectors that are important, really. The US private sector normally, historically, almost always actually, apart from the latter part of the 1990s and the early 2000s, has been in surplus. It's natural for the private sector to be in surplus. It's natural for the private sector overall to net save over time. And the US government has nearly always been in deficit. The only significant period of government budget surpluses in the US in recent history, and by recent history I'm saying all the way back to the 1950s, is the end of the Clinton administration. Remember those surpluses? Remember when they were talking about paying back all the government's debt at that time? MMT Economists was saying you're not going to be able to do that because what's happening to private sector balance sheets is fundamentally unsustainable and is going to lead to an economic crisis if it continues. People like Wynne Godley were saying that at the end of the 1990s. And of course, what happened after the year 2000 was the US stock market bubble burst. They then, by deregulating the financial system and cutting interest rates nearly all the way to zero, they managed to inflate temporarily a housing bubble. But then that burst. And of course, when that burst, the private sector balance naturally under those circumstances, because of spending crashing, goes into surplus. And the government balance goes towards deficit. Some of that is a deliberate stimulus. Most of it was just automatic fiscal stabilizers at work. But what we can see here is the US government running a budget surplus did nothing to create a more stable and sustainable financial system in the US. Quite the opposite. It contributed towards the financial fragility, which led to the GFC. And you can see the same thing on a stacked bar chart on the right there. Again, blue, that stands for the private sector balance. Green is the foreign balance. Red is the government balance. When you see the private sector going significantly into deficit, you need to at least ask why. It might be appropriate. It might be the consequence of very high levels of productive investment by businesses. But if it's largely result of rising household debt, and if it's associated with asset bubbles, that's the time to sit up and take notice. That's why, it's one of the reasons why the chief economist at Goldman Sachs described this as the world's most important chart. Another Wall Street operator, Rob Parenteau, developed a chart which I also think is useful, so we'll quickly look at. I won't spend too long on. I'm calling it, as some people, other people have, a Parenteau chart. What the Parenteau chart has on the horizontal axis is the country's current account balance, and on the vertical axis, the government's balance. So at the top, obviously, there's government surplus. At the bottom, there's a government deficit. On the right-hand side, a current account surplus. Well, that's the foreign sector being in deficit on the US monetary system, when that has happened, rarely in recent decades. And on the left-hand side, we're talking about a US current account deficit. The foreign sector then is in surplus. Well, if the foreign sector is in surplus and the government is in surplus, the US private sector will be in deficit. And that's what I've said we ought to be paying attention to anyway, because the private sector does not seem to be able to run deficits for very long without financial fragility, Minsky financial fragility developing. It's something that we need to pay attention to. You can see the Clinton years up here, the government budget being in surplus there. If the government budget is in surplus, if the current account is in deficit, then the private sector must be in deficit. The private sector will also be in deficit if the country is running a current account surplus, but that current account surplus is not big enough to offset the government budget surplus, or if the government budget is in deficit, but that government budget deficit is not big enough to offset the current account deficit. You've got weakening private sector balance sheets over time under these circumstances. Either the private sector is going further into debt, or else the economy is going to move towards recession. And under those circumstances, rapidly, the private sector will move back towards surplus and the government budget will move towards deficit again. Here's the position for Germany, of course, not strictly speaking a monetary sovereign, but the powerhouse economy within the Eurozone. And you can see that if we go back at least to the early 1990s, in other words, post-German reunification for Germany, you can see that the US private sector has been running surpluses all the time. Early on during that period, pre-Euro, we can see what funded these private surpluses: government deficits. Government deficits supported the German economy and allowed the German private sector to be in surplus. Post-Euro, what's happened, as we know, is that Germany has moved towards a bigger and bigger current account surplus. And in the early years, Germany's current account surplus had a counterpart, which was current account deficits in other countries within the Eurozone. If you run a current account surplus, then the private sector can be in surplus without the government doing deficit spending. That's the story in frugal Germany in recent times. The trouble is, somebody else then has to do the deficit spending. Suppose there were only two countries in the Eurozone and the other one was called Spain. If Germany is going to run big current account surpluses, then assuming that the Eurozone overall for much of this period had approximately balanced trade with the rest of the world, then Spain would have to run growing current account deficits. And if the Spanish government is prevented from running large budget deficits by the rules of the Eurozone, then that means the Spanish private sector must be going further and further into deficit, and the counterpart of that German current account surplus is going to be a Spanish private sector deficit and increasingly fragile Spanish private balance sheets, which is likely to go along with an asset price bubble, which of course in Spain was a property price bubble. Well, there's Germany's Pareto chart. I've added that horizontal line there opposite a 3% deficit for the government budget, because of course that's fundamentally the most important element in the Stability and Growth Pact after the Eurozone came in. You might notice that much of the time even Germany didn't meet the terms of the Stability and Growth Pact, and as you can see, the economy moving towards current account surplus in the early 2000s. In those early years, Germany was actually outside the 3% GDP limit for the government budget deficit, but the political economy of the Eurozone meant it was impossible for Germany to be fined for that. And in recent years, of course, the German government has been able to run a budget surplus while the private sector is still safely in surplus in Germany. Well, somebody else must be running the deficits. Balance sheets interlock. If there are surpluses in one part of the monetary system, there must be deficits somewhere else. And here we've got Spain's sectoral balances chart. Again, look at either version, whichever one you prefer. What you can see pre-Eurozone is that the private sector in Spain either ran surpluses or was approximately in balance, and this was funded by government budget deficits. What you can see post-Eurozone is that the Spanish government, and they were lauded for it at the time, they were praised for this at the time, by the time the global financial crisis came around, was running budget surpluses. It wasn't running budget deficits at all. Did that protect Spain? when the global financial crisis struck and when the consequences spread to Europe and the European property market crashed and German investors wanted to take their money out of Spain again? No, of course it didn't. In fact, of course, what was happening was that although the government wasn't running a deficit, Spain was running growing current account deficits, as I've said, which to an extent you can see as the counterpart of the German current account surpluses. And the deficit spending was taking place within the Spanish private sector. Now, when that crashed, of course, the Spanish government budget went well back into deficit again, but then they had to practice austerity as part of the terms of the bailout that they received within the Eurozone. And that austerity prolonged mass unemployment in Spain because Spain then suffered the consequences of not being a monetary sovereign. Here's the Pareto chart for Spain. You can see how rarely over the last 40 years, Spain has actually been above that 3% government deficit line. You can see the period immediately prior to the global financial crisis, where the Spanish government, being a good, prudent government, was running a budget surplus. Did that help Spain when the crisis struck? No, quite the opposite. It meant the Spanish private sector was well into deficit, and it meant Spain had a very fragile monetary system, particularly banking system, and suffered enormously when the consequences of the US financial crash struck Europe and struck the Spanish property market as well. Here's Japan. Now, I said you lose a lot of detail when you aggregate like this. And as we know, Japan had its big financial crash around about 1990 or really in the early 1990s. And you don't see Japan's private sector going very far into deficit at that time, but you do see a small deficit. It's the only deficit in relatively recent Japanese economic history as far as the private sector is concerned. The other thing you notice is that this was the only period in relatively recent Japanese economic history when the government ran a budget surplus. So again, is a government budget surplus a sign that the government is acting prudently and that there is a stable and sustainable set of financial arrangements, set of balance sheets within the domestic economy? No. The only time the Japanese government has been running a surplus in recent decades was immediately before the Japanese stock market and property market bubbles crashed and Japan had its financial crisis, which in some ways it's never recovered from. And as you can see, Japan, as is the case generally historically, has the private sector wanting to run financial surpluses over time, acquiring net financial assets. And these net financial assets, well, in the case of Japan, they partially are funded by the country running current account surpluses, but they're largely funded by the government running budget deficits over time. Deficit spending by the government allows the private sector to run surpluses and to have healthy balance sheets. Here's Japan's Pareto chart, and you can see, as I said, they only went very briefly into the private deficit area, and that was just before the Japanese economy crashed. Advanced economies in general. I've put BIS up here. Actually, this is IMF data. I'm sorry, that's a typo at the top there. The IMF classifies, I think, 39 or 40 countries as advanced economies, and this is looking across all those advanced economies, going back to 2001, which is as far back in time as this particular data set goes. And what can we see about advanced economies during periods of relative economic boom and crisis and recovery and crisis again? We can see that if you look across all advanced economies, well, obviously their foreign sector balance is going to be approximately zero. And you can see that it's normal for the private sector to run surpluses. When the private sector almost went into deficit, well, that was just before the global financial crisis. And you can see that it's normal for governments to run deficits. Deficits are nothing to be scared about. They're perfectly normal. and indeed healthy insofar as they allow the private sector to acquire net financial assets in a way which is not inflationary and which is not going to contribute towards a financial crisis, but instead is going to make a financial crisis less likely, not more, in the future. It is government budget surpluses which are unsustainable, not government budget deficits. There's the advanced economies Pareto chart, and it never once goes into the private deficit region. I included the Stability and Growth Pact rule of 3% of GDP government deficit, just to show that most of the time, the great majority of the time, advanced economies in general, since the millennium, have been running bigger budget deficits than allowed under the rules of the Eurozone. And here's Australia. Now, I was really worried about Australia, and I have been for some time, well before the global financial crisis. Why? Because we have a really unusual sectoral balances chart, and I'm going to show you the consequences in a few moments. Sure, Australia, and we could go back to 1974 here, has been running a current account deficit, so the rest of the world has been net lending to us. And by the way, they've been net lending to us in our own currency. We, as an economy, do not have net financial liabilities in foreign currency. Our net financial liabilities are entirely in our own currency. There is a chart on the RBA website in the chart pack that you can look up just to confirm that. But the rest of the world has been wanting to accumulate Australian dollar denominated assets continuously since 1974. That's a foreign sector financial surplus. It's a current account deficit for us, which was temporarily, in a very minor way, reversed last year for the first time since 1974. Okay, fair enough. Well, what's funding that foreign sector surplus on our monetary system? One of the other two sectors has to be in deficit. If we got the balance of our fiscal policy and our monetary policy and our financial regulation right over the last 3 decades, it should have been deficit spending by the government, which kept the economy close to full employment, allowed the private sector to net save, to be in surplus, which is the normal healthy position for private sector balance sheets to be in. And sure, we would have been running government deficits over time. And if you think it's important, the government's net debt would have been significantly higher than 20% of GDP, which is roughly where it's been in recent times. But we would have had, in my view, a less fragile, more stable balance sheet, and we could have organised our property market so that we didn't have something which many people think has approximated in recent years, if not a bubble, something very close to it, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, that if we had a prolonged period of mass unemployment where people were not being allowed to suspend mortgage payments, etc., could potentially cause severe issues in Australia. But look what we've had. We've been running private sector deficits from the mid-1990s all the way up to the GFC. And it is, of course, those private deficits. Now, part of that was borrowing by mining companies, but most of it was household debt, was the accumulation of household debt, which supported the economy and tax receipts for the government and allowed the Howard Costello government to run fiscal surpluses for 8 out of the 10 years when they were in power. You'll also notice that for most of the period since the Rudd stimulus, the government deficit has not been high enough to allow the private sector to remain in surplus. So we've continued to run, albeit very small, private deficits basically up until now, since about 2012 or so. We have obsessed about borrowing by the currency issuer that doesn't need to borrow in the first place, and where its debt should not be thought of as debt in the conventional sense of the term, because it never has to be repaid in the sense that it can always be rolled over, and also in the sense that they're not forced to issue government bonds in the first place. Those government bonds don't, strictly speaking, fund government spending when you're a monetary sovereign. We've obsessed about the government running deficits and a return to surplus, and we've largely ignored what's been happening to private balance sheets. It is extremely unusual to see all those blue bars below the horizontal axis there in the negative side. That is something to be concerned about. Trends in our property market and housing debt, household debt, are something to be concerned about. And our Pareto chart looks different to almost everybody else, except maybe Iceland just before they had their banking crisis. We've been in private deficit almost the whole time. How come? Well, the rest of the world has been running a surplus on our monetary system, and either the government's been running a surplus when Peter Costello was the treasurer, or the government deficit has not been big enough to offset that foreign sector surplus, so that the private sector has had to do the deficit spending in order to support our economy and hold it, if not close to full employment, a lot closer than it otherwise would have been, had the private sector not been prepared to keep going further and further into debt to sustain economic activity and support the property market. And just to show you the results of this, okay, so we've been looking at Spain, Germany, USA, Japan, and Australia. I could have showed you lots of countries. I've got these charts for lots of countries. There's a couple of steps that you have to take between looking at the private sector financial balance of a country and gross household debt. One step is, of course, that the private sector doesn't just include households, it also includes businesses, financial and non-financial corporates. Another step you need to take, in principle, a sector could be in balance and yet gross debt within that sector could be increasing because you might be going further into debt yourself. You might be a deficit unit on our monetary system. If I'm net saving, if I'm a surplus unit and we're both within the household sector, when you aggregate us, we'll cancel out. But in general, it is nonetheless normally the case that when the private sector is moving rapidly and significantly into deficit, then the kind of policies which are encouraging this will also normally be tending to encourage an increase in household debt. And as we can see here, Australia's household debt to GDP ratio has basically trebled since the early 1990s. We've gone from being a country with far less household debt than Germany or the USA or Japan to having, relative to the size of our economy, twice as much household debt, at least as Japan and Germany. You can see, as I was mentioning before, when the Spanish private sector went significantly into deficit, Spanish households accumulated a huge amount of debt. The household debt to GDP ratio in Spain more or less quadrupled during those years. Of course, in the years since, with the government budget going into deficit following the crisis, private balance sheets have been restored somewhat. The debt to GDP ratio has fallen. And something similar has happened in the USA. I showed you that in Japan and Germany, the private sector has either never been in deficit during this period or only very slightly. In Japan, and what you can see here is there's been no upward trend. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but it's basically right. There's been no upward trend in household debt to GDP in those countries over time. It also tends to have been the case, by the way, that in these countries that have been going through the most financialization and the most rapid increases in household debt, they tend to have been the countries where inequality has been rising fastest too. So, some useful charts. At least I hope they were interesting. Things modern monetary theorists never say. We never say, and I hope this is obvious now, we never say government should spend without limit. What did I say before? I said that when we are assessing the fiscal programs of governments, we should always do our best to forecast the potential inflationary consequences of those fiscal programs. We never say the government's deficit doesn't matter. It matters, but not the way you might think. Our government is a monetary sovereign currency issuer. Insolvency is never an issue. The government's deficit is simply a deposit of dollars the government is placing somewhere in the banking system, in our monetary system. If they then issue treasury bonds, if they auction treasury bonds, they're just giving the private sector the option of converting what are effectively transaction balances at the Reserve Bank of Australia for transferable term deposits at the Reserve Bank of Australia. That's really all that bond issuance is. Deficits matter, all right. If you obsess too much about balancing your budget or returning to surplus or paying back the government's debt, then you're going to tend to introduce policies which, well, if you can deliver a large sustained current account surplus, you're just exporting the problem to somebody else. Otherwise, the policies that you're going to be sustaining will be driving the private sector into deficit, and that tends to involve, and in Australia definitely has, involved a rapid increase in household debt. We never say taxes are unnecessary. We do say that taxes do not pay for government spending at the federal level. We say taxes are important initially to create a demand for a currency, and beyond that, they're important in sustaining that demand or sustaining the value of the currency, limiting the ability of the private sector to spend so that total spending in the economy does not go beyond the productive capacity of the economy. That does not mean, as I said earlier, that the only way you can react to inflationary pressures is to increase taxes. MMT economists are in favour of getting down to the nitty-gritty and looking to see which part of the consumer price index is under pressure if inflation is expected to increase, and trying to address that. But there are a variety of other ways of reacting. But yeah, certainly there will be circumstances where you might increase the tax take to limit the ability of the private sector to spend and bear down on inflation. You might cut back on government spending under those circumstances. You might tighten up on regulation of the banking system and credit under those circumstances. There are a variety of other things you could do. Personally, I'm not in favour of the use of increases in interest rates, at least under normal circumstances, as a way of trying to limit inflationary pressures, particularly in economies where there is a high level of household debt. We never, ever, ever say inflation isn't an issue. And a Rogoff-inspired joke, having watched his debate with James Galbraith in Russia in January, we certainly never say central planning is a great idea. Of course we don't. What we want is a healthy, mixed economy. Things others have said, which are factually incorrect. A year or a year and a half ago, Philip Lowe, the governor of the RBA, said Australia needs more fiscal discipline today to make room for fiscal policy to be used when there's a downturn. Of course, that's not true. The Japanese government has 6 times as much debt as us relative to the size of the economy. They're a monetary sovereign. They're equally able to increase government spending when necessary to support the economy as we are. Monetary sovereign governments, in principle, when it's appropriate, don't have a limitation in terms of their ability to net spend. Surely that's being demonstrated in Australia at the moment. If our net debt to GDP ratio had not been 20%, but had been 40% or 60% or 80%, it wouldn't have made any difference to the freedom that Josh Frydenberg had to go heavily into deficit to support the economy at the moment. Janet Yellen, former chair of the Fed in the US, said last year people should lose sleep over the size of the national debt. Well, they'll be losing a lot more sleep now if they do. But the US is a monetary sovereign government. US government debt, it's not the nation's debt at all, first of all, it's the government's debt. But US government debt is just those US dollars that the government has spent into circulation that they haven't taxed back out of circulation yet. It's the same thing as saying people should lose sleep over the amount of US dollars held by the non-government part of the US monetary system, or people should lose sleep over the size of the US net money supply, to use the term that I prefer to use? Of course they shouldn't. The only way that could ever be a problem would be if it somehow fueled excess spending in the US, which was inflationary. Kenneth Rogoff, not only Kenneth Rogoff, but Stanley Fischer as well, have been quoted in the past as saying investors in the bond market could force a contraction in government spending in the US by going on a bond buying strike. Of course, this is nonsense, absolute and complete nonsense. The Japanese central bank owns well over 40% of Japanese government debt. The European Central Bank in Europe is not far away from that. The Fed in the US is again buying US government debt on the secondary market at the moment, quantitative easing. The Bank of England in the UK, to an extent, is funding government spending directly. I shouldn't really use that word funding, but just giving the government more of an overdraft facility at the moment, which is normal. Issuing government debt, if you're a monetary sovereign government, is an optional operation. And if it has any purpose at all, it's a monetary purpose, a monetary policy purpose. It's not about fiscal policy. It's not necessary for the US government to issue treasury bonds, for which of course there's enormous demand around the world at the moment, but it's not necessary for them to do that in order to fund their spending. US government spending is funded when the Congress authorizes that spending. Australian government spending is funded when our parliament passes a budget, when our parliament authorizes that spending. That is when spending is funded by or within a monetary sovereign economy. In a sense, it's self-funding. Remember the STAB acronym. You spend dollars into circulation. You tax some of those dollars back out of circulation again. The gap between what you spend and your tax and what you tax. Sure, it's a government deficit. It's a non-government surplus. It's a deposit the government is placing somewhere in the banking system. It matters where those dollars are going. It matters if they're going to you or me, or to Virgin Blue, or to Gina Reinhardt, or to a foreign investor. Sure, it matters, but that government deficit is somebody else's surplus. You need to look at how the balance sheets within our monetary system interact over time. Deficit spending is normal, as I've just shown you. And it can even be seen as playing a positive role in our economy, supplying nominally safe financial assets for the private sector to hold, supporting the economy, allowing the private sector to acquire net financial assets to net save. A government deficit funds a private surplus. It's not the other way around. Paul Krugman talked about government deficits crowding out private sector investment by putting upward pressure on interest rates. Stephanie Kelton, in her debate with him, said, no, Paul, you're a bit misled by the old ISLM model. When you look at how reserve accounting works, if the government runs a deficit and does not issue treasury bonds to withdraw that deficit spending from the banking system, then the government deficit puts downward pressure on interest rates, not upward pressure on interest rates. And the only way that government deficits could be seen to crowd out private sector investment would be if that was additional deficit spending taking place when the economy was close to full employment and when that spending was inflationary, in which case you can imagine increased interest rates, for example, might be the mechanism used in order to restrain inflation. And not that there's very much evidence that private investment spending is highly interest elastic, but you can imagine the concerns about rising inflation and interest rates might put downward pressure on investment spending then. But under normal circumstances, when the economy is not close to full employment, deficit spending by governments sustains demand, allows businesses to be more profitable, and helps them to fund more investment spending and gives them an incentive to engage in additional investment spending because, of course, they're only going to invest if they expect a demand for what they're producing. Various people who will remain nameless because they include some famous Australian economist has said things along the lines of what you can see at the bottom here. Those crazy modern monetary theorists think there are unlimited real resources. Nobody could possibly think that if they'd done any reading about modern monetary theory at all. And I don't mean reading a social media post by an MMT enthusiast. I mean going back to looking at the core literature by those academics who developed modern monetary theory, or even looking at what I've written in various places, including that book, Economics for Sustainable Prosperity, that was on the first slide. Things people like me say, which may or may not be correct or incorrect. Unemployment has been a political choice. Well, sure, yeah. We can certainly afford full employment. We've got a monetary sovereign government. It's just about getting the institutions right to deliver equitable full employment without it being inflationary. Inequality has been a political choice. Austerity, privatization, financialization has contributed towards inequality rising in Australia. Inequality was at its lowest level in Australia in the mid-1970s, the last time we had full employment. So if unemployment's been a political choice, then inequality has been a political choice too. There are other economies where inequality has not increased the way it has. Here, I'm talking about the Scandinavian countries and South Korea as well, either for reasons relating to pre-distribution or the redistribution that a more progressive tax and welfare system has provided in those Scandinavian countries. Record household debt's been a political choice. Yeah, sure. If you want to try and get the economy to grow and you're not running a current account surplus where the impetus for that growth comes from demand from abroad, then either it's going to be deficit spending by the government or it's going to be deficit spending by the private sector. And in Australia, it's been deficit spending by households. People used to talk about the Australian economy riding on the sheep's back. And during the early 2000s, the Australian economy rode on the back of households, household debt. Households are not monetary sovereign currency issuers. And we have the issue of the second highest level of household debt to GDP in the world now, and people like Steve Keen addressing that by talking about debt jubilees. That's not a preferred policy option as far as I'm concerned, but I can see where he's coming from, and it's certainly something which technically is affordable. We could have chosen differently. We could have kept full employment in Australia. We could have aimed to maintain a lower level of inequality. We had in Australia 50 years ago a Scandinavian level of inequality. We don't anymore. We could have avoided the property market bubble and the enormous growth in household debt if we've regulated our banking system differently and had a different attitude towards fiscal policy and towards housing generally. That's what I think. I'm not going to talk now because I've been talking for such a long time about a federal job guarantee, but our superior automatic fiscal stabilizer and the mechanism whereby we would deliver a loose form of full employment in Australia is to introduce a federal job guarantee, such as the one that Bernie Sanders was campaigning for in the recent contest for the Democratic nomination in the US. We had full employment in Australia in the 1950s and 1960s. A typical level of unemployment was somewhere between 1% and 2%. Robert Menzies almost lost a federal election in 1962 because unemployment went marginally above 2% when we didn't have any underemployment. And that was seen as a crisis at the time. It seems a shame. We had full employment up until 1974. Now we can't go back to the same economic and institutional setup that we had then, of course, but we think that by implementing a modern, locally managed but federally funded job guarantee, we could restore full employment. We could eliminate involuntary unemployment. We could give people the option, if during a downturn they lost their employment, they lost their job, to opt to work in an area which, broadly speaking, would be about environmental care or caring for society as well. I'm not going to go into all the various ideas about job opportunities which would be available to people within the job guarantee. But a job guarantee with normal, decent conditions of work, and where you were in receipt of the minimum wage, and a minimum wage somewhat above the minimum statutory wage we've had in Australia in the past, is something that we would like to introduce. And how would it be an automatic stabiliser? Well, if the economy is booming, then of course the scalable activities you've got in the job guarantee will be scaled down. People will leave the job guarantee and they'll move into better paid jobs in the private sector or conventional public sector. If there is a downturn, then people will automatically move back into the job guarantee again. If they choose to, I'd still have a minimum and unconditional payment for people who chose not to participate in the job guarantee. But if you're in the job guarantee, you know, you'll be on $40,000 a year, and you'll be able to participate in socially valuable activities, and your self-esteem won't take such a hit. You'll maintain your social connections. You'll continue to be in the habit of going to work. The job guarantee scheme will act as the old Commonwealth Employment Service did to match up people who are looking for employment with local employment vacancies, will provide optional training opportunities. There's a lot more to talk about. It's a policy which has been widely canvassed across the US, and there is support for a federal job guarantee in, I think, every US state, in the majority of Democrat voters, a majority of independents, and I think it's about 50-50 with Republican voters. And in Australia, I believe Get Up had a survey done relating to a federal job guarantee, and there's widespread support for one in Australia too. So what's stopping us? We have to go right the way back to the beginning of this talk. The game of policy making is rigged. The prince is constrained by the theory of his intellectuals. We've got the wrong view of public finance. We're obsessed with the government trying to run budget surpluses. We're obsessed with austerity. It goes all the way back really to the story of money that we started with. The notion that money is a commodity which is in short supply, where there's no distinction between the federal government and the rest of us, where the government is treated as though it's a currency user rather than a currency issuer that can get into solvency problems if it's deficit spending. And this misunderstanding is just as widespread on the Labour Party side of the aisle as it is on the coalition side. So Warren Mosler, one of the people that developed modern monetary theory along with the Australian academic Bill Mitchell and others, has said lack of understanding of the monetary system has been the worst enemy of the progressive agenda. I 100% agree about this. That's not to say that MMT in itself is left-wing or right-wing. As I've said, it just describes how sovereign monetary systems work. However, it does make it clear that government decisions down the years which have been presented to us as being necessary from an economic perspective have in fact just been political decisions. I've had politicians, well, let's pick on all the parties. I've had a politician from the Greens talk to me in the past and say, you know, it's just not practical for us to use an MMT frame for talking about fiscal policy. And that's always made me think about this quote from the general theory. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Milton Friedman was a very intelligent man, a great politician and a great pragmatist, and in some respects not a bad mathematician, but I think he's a defunct economist. And I think that it's not just conservatives in Australia and elsewhere, but often progressives too, that are intimidated when it comes to talking about the appropriate role for the government budget in the economy, because they bought into that narrative we're all used to about the government budget, and about the idea that if the government runs deficits, it's irresponsible and it will lead to a crisis. Quite the opposite is true, as I've been trying to say. What's to stop governments behaving irresponsibly? Before an election, the Parliamentary Budget Office should have the job of assessing party programmes not for their impact on the budget per se, but for their impact on inflation risk in our economy. Our goal should be non-inflationary full employment alongside ecological sustainability. It's up to us as voters and up to Parliament to ensure the governments don't behave irresponsibly. Now, if you want to write to me, if you're interested in a reading list relating to MMT, I'm quite happy to help you out with that. It has long historical roots in the state theory of money as developed more than 100 years ago by George Friedrich Knapp, and the credit theory of money as developed by Alfred Mitchell-Innes, again more than 100 years ago. MMT has some roots, particularly in the Treatise of Money in Keynes' work, and in the work of his contemporary Michal Kalecki. J. Beardsley Rummel was the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve when in 1946 he published an article or paper entitled Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete. I recommend you to look that up on the internet. Rummel understood then pretty much what I've been talking about now, most of it. Aberlerner, it was his paper that was entitled Money as a Creature of the State. Lerner is associated with functional finance, the idea that the government budget balance should be wherever it needs to be in order to maintain full employment. We've got a slightly more sophisticated view of things now in our modern monetary system, but Lerner is one of the forerunners of MMT, as is Hyman Minsky, who explained that if you base economic development on growing private debt, then there is a tendency for private balance sheets to move towards riskier and riskier positions, leading eventually to a crisis. Wynne Godley, who developed stock flow consistent macroeconomics and the sectoral balances model I've been talking about. MMT itself, building on the work of all these people, has been developed by a fund manager, Warren Mosler, an American academic, Randy Wray, an Australian academic, Bill Mitchell, who you may be familiar with, of course, Stephanie Kelton, who is the global face of modern monetary theory, really, and a range of other important economists I could mention that you might want to look up. Pavlina Tcherneva, Scott Fulwiler, Farrell Kaboub, Matt Forstater, there are so many more. If you want something which is a great read for the general public, I've read it already. It's a fantastic book. I think it's going to be a bestseller on MMT. Stephanie's got a book coming out in June called The Deficit Myth. For the general public and for economists looking for a plain English version for discussion with clients, stakeholders, and other non-economists. If you want a full macroeconomics textbook based on modern monetary theory, and it's a bestseller, then the macro book written by Bill Mitchell, Randy Wray, and Bill's colleague at Newcastle, Martin Watts, was published last year, suitable for a 2-semester course in introductory and intermediate macroeconomics. If you want to learn how to do stock flow consistent macroeconomic modeling in detail, the Bible is Monetary Economics by Wynne Godley and Mark Lavoie. And if you want an example of Godley and Lavoie's approach being used to model an actual economy and fitted to data, then it's not a perfect working paper, but there's a pretty good working paper from the Bank of England that there's a link to on this slide. If you want to look at some interesting research with some associated econometrics applying MMT and stock flow consistent macroeconomics to the US economy, particularly, there's a lot of that, including published by the Levy Institute at Bard College in New York. There's a couple of papers co-authored by, amongst others, Stephanie Kelton. One of them's about a job guarantee. The other one is about the macroeconomic effects of cancelling student debt. If you want something which is also excellent, a little bit out of date now, but is free, and you can just download online, then Warren Mosler's book, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, is a great read as well, and I strongly recommend it. And I've gone on for ages and ages and ages, but you set me a very difficult task I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Thanks very much. You're muted, Lachlan.
There we go. Thanks, Stephen. Fantastic. Now, what we might do, Stephen, just because we've had dozens and dozens and dozens of questions, if I asked maybe a couple of the most pertinent questions, Stephen, are you happy if I provide you with a list of the other questions and we sort of do it as a question on notice type sort of thing? I can send out a list of answers to your questions.
That would be great. What I'd be more than happy to do, if you've got somewhere where you can publish them, is if you can send me lots of questions, because I imagine there'll be a lot of questions. I'll write answers tomorrow.
42 so far. We're at 42 questions.
Okay, well, we're not going to answer 42 questions
now.
But if you send them to me, I'll write answers to them all. And then you could maybe publish the answers. Would that help?
No worries. What I might do is I might just take two, maybe three, just some conscious it's getting late. I'll maybe just take 2 or 3. So Danielle Wood, who's budget director at the Grattan Institute and president of the ESA, had a fantastic question here. Why do you think the federal government is better placed than the independent central bank to manage inflation? Surely it's much harder to raise tax/cut spending if inflation breaks out than raising the cash rate.
I think that monetary policy is essentially broken. I think that if you significantly raise the cash rate in our economy, the way it stands at the moment, with household balance sheets the way they are, and with up to 30% of mortgage holders in financial distress, according to some measures, before this crisis broke out, I think the unintended consequences of that might be very significant indeed. I didn't say at any stage, however, during my discussion that raising taxes or cutting government spending is the only way of managing inflation risk. And if you want to continue to have the central bank set the cash rate, actually they're not hitting their target for the cash rate at the moment because of quantitative easing. So effectively, they're no longer targeting the overnight interest rate. They're targeting interest rate on 3-year government bonds now. But if you want to have the Reserve Bank, whichever interest rate it chooses to target, manage interest rates in order to aim for an inflation target, well, that's fine, because modern monetary theory is just a discussion of the way the system works at the moment. It doesn't really change very much of my discussion.
No worries. Quickly, I will be slightly self-indulgent and just ask questions. So one of the things that's always sort of, as you sort of alluded to, and there's a few questions that have sort of alluded to this, one of the things that's always sort of amused me is the idea that MMT is to the left or to the right. As I've said to a number of friends who've worked as staffers in the coalition government, or they've worked at classical liberal think tanks like the IPA or the Adam Smith Institute, I've said to them, in my initial, and I had actually just had a short email exchange with Danielle on this point, my first reaction on encountering MMT was when working in the microeconomic reform unit at PM&C. And my initial reaction was not, oh, great, we now have all the money we want in the world to buy everyone a pony. My first reaction was, thank God we can now have a debate about microeconomic reform, structural reform, productivity growth that is not hobbled out of the gate by the assumption that the government has to be, that everything has to be revenue neutral. It really just has to be inflation neutral in the short run. And if it's productivity enhancing, then over the long run, you're expanding the productive capacity of the economy and expanding the limits of the... So I remember Ken Henry's comment from 2012 saying the number one challenge facing would-be microeconomic reformers is we no longer have the revenue to buy off the losers of reform. And to me, that's fascinating. I was driving home when I think Chris Bowen or Bill Shorten came on the radio during the debate about the company tax cuts. And they said, well, we can't have company tax cuts because it'll bankrupt Medicare. And I nearly crashed my car because I thought, well, that's financially, that's technically incorrect. So I guess my question is to you is just briefly, I know you're a macroeconomist rather than a microeconomist, but what are some of the structural reform implications in terms of how we think about, not just how we think about expanding the welfare state, but how we think about on the supply side and microeconomic reform issues? What are some of those implications there from, I guess, an endogenous public finance perspective?
Oh, you probably answer that question better than me. I don't necessarily think of myself as a macroeconomist. I'm someone that trains bankers. So what attracts me to modern monetary theory is that I'm comfortable with balance sheets and I'm comfortable with monetary operations and understanding how they actually work. And why I was really interested in modern monetary theory initially is just that it's correct. And that, for me, is enough. And if you don't, every MMT economist that I know is in favour of a federal job guarantee, because all the ones I know are basically progressives, but you don't have to be if you are not concerned about full employment, if you are not concerned about rising inequality, if you have a different set of values and objectives to the ones that I might personally hold, then you should still be interested in modern monetary theory, just because it's right. And it's not, so for me, I'm sorry, I'm sort of deflecting the question here. But basically, whatever you're discussing, you should use an MMT perspective just because it's correct. And I would turn around some of the questions maybe. When people say, are you saying that the government can run deficits forever? Well, potentially, yes, if it's not inflationary. But I'd like to turn that question around and say to a conservative mainstream economist, do you think the government can run surpluses forever? Because I don't.
Mm. We've just got,
because surpluses basically just vacuum Australian dollars out of the monetary system, drive the private sector into debt, and rising private sector debt at some point becomes unsustainable.
We did have just because I'm conscious of time, but we had, I think, probably maybe the juiciest question besides Danielle's was something that I know you and I have discussed many times before, but a general issue around the way central bankers communicate the operations of the contemporary monetary system. So Joseph asked, in a speech today, RBA Governor Phil Lowe said, quote, one of the underlying principles of Australia's institutional arrangements is the separation of monetary and fiscal policy. That is, the central bank does not finance the government, instead the government finances itself in the market. This principle has served the country well, and I am confident that the Australian federal, state and territory governments will continue to be able to finance themselves in the market as they should, end quote.
He's a fibber. He is a fibber. I'll come straight out and say he's a fibber. If you are pursuing a target for the yield on Australian Commonwealth government debt, when the Australian government is issuing a lot of debt, you are ensuring that you are funding the Australian Commonwealth government. And that's what they're doing at the moment. If the Treasury is issuing debt in the primary market and the RBA is buying that debt up in the secondary market faster than the Treasury is issuing it, then you end up with a set of balance sheets which is identical to if the RBA had just bought the debt directly from the government. And some other central banks, of course, well, first of all, some of them have always done this, like the Bank of Canada. Secondly, the RBA did it to an extent before 1982. And thirdly, in the UK, the Bank of England, they say they're not doing this, but they're just giving the government an overdraft, basically a limitless overdraft, although they're saying they're doing it temporarily. This is much better understood by people who work on the operations side of central banks than by people who have jobs as economists in central banks. They often don't talk to each other very closely. I think people who work on the operations side instinctively understand this. I've had someone come from the RBA and work as a tutor for me at uni on first year finance and just tell me it was just what's the word? It's refreshing to have someone talk about how reserve accounting actually works, how the system actually works, because so much of the time, the people that work on the operations side and the economists in the RBA and other central banks, they just talk past each other. As far as Philip Lowe is concerned, he has to be a politician to a considerable extent, and sometimes you can find him one day saying something that seems very different to what he said the previous day. But he's not right. Central banks and governments cooperate closely over time. Of course they do. Treasury bond issuance, for example, has major implications for bank exchange settlement accounts, and reserves in bank exchange settlement accounts under normal circumstances have to be closely managed by the RBA, or they lose control of the cash rate. That was the way the system worked before the 18th of March. And what they're doing at the moment is the RBA is buying up treasury bonds as quickly or more quickly than the Treasury via the AOFM is issuing them. If that's not funding government deficit spending, I don't know what is. Really.
We might just have time for one more question, and it's not a short one, but I know you've got a pithy response to it because you and I have just discussed this before. How do MMT economists explain hyperinflation? I know you alluded to it earlier, but everyone jumps on this. Various tenured economists have jumped on this. I know that to an extent the answer is because the supply of money is irrelevant to inflation. It's the spending of money, as the Bank of England has now said. It's the excess spending of money that causes high inflation, not the excess supply of money. And it goes to show the extent to which monetarist assumptions still embed a lot of even so-called new Keynesian thinking, essentially is kind of Friedmanism with a bit of fiscal stimulus added over the top. But I'll let you sort of answer that. How would an MMT economist explain Zimbabwe? As I now just use the phrase Zimbabwean, because I've yet to meet an MMT critic who actually distinguishes between Venezuela or Zimbabwe. So to save them time, I just call it the Zimbabwean example. How would an MMT economist explain hyperinflation?
Well, in the case of Zimbabwe, well, let's start from Australia, first of all. I have talked about inflation in this long talk I've done several times. Every proposal, every fiscal proposal should always be assessed in terms of its inflation risk. MMT economists talk much more about inflation actually than non-MMT economists do, because non-MMT economists, when they talk about fiscal policy, always focus on the return to surplus or a balanced budget. And what we say is, no, that's not the right way of thinking about fiscal policy. The right way of thinking about fiscal policy is the implications of your plans as far as inflation is concerned. But if we go to Zimbabwe for a moment, what happened in Zimbabwe was, for partly understandable reasons, the Zimbabwean government introduced an extremely incompetent and violent approach to land reform, where in an agrarian economy, when they're already subject to sanctions for the rest of the world, so nobody really was going to help them, it was in a position to help them, they caused agricultural production to collapse. If you shoot all your farmers or you throw them off the land and agricultural productivity collapses in a country where agriculture makes up a very high proportion of gross domestic product, then food prices will start rising. If you then try and create currency to buy non-existent food, if you run very large deficits to allow party members and close associates to still be able to obtain food, then you're just going to be chasing food prices up and up and up. And that's basically the Zimbabwe story. So initially, and this is the case with all hyperinflations, in the case of Venezuela, partly it's to do with external factors, partly it's to do with a collapse in oil production. But in the case of Zimbabwe, it's largely a collapse in agricultural production. Prices start rising. If you, in inverted commas, print money when there's nothing to buy, then of course you're going to drive the price level up faster and faster and faster and create hyperinflation. But without being facetious, if you want to do that in Australia, I don't know, you'd have to shoot all the farmers and close down all the factories, and which I suppose to an extent, closing down all the factories, etc., has happened to us inadvertently, temporarily at the moment. So yes, you have to pay very close attention to inflation. And what MMT economists like Stephanie always say is that we pride ourselves on thinking more carefully about inflation than other economists. And it's inflation that's the issue. We never, ever, ever argue for limitless spending. We always say every economy, including our own, exists with a speed limit or a real resource constraint. And if you try to spend over and above that real resource constraint, there'll be accelerating inflation.
Terrific. We might leave it there just because I'm conscious of time. But yeah, as I say, I think we're now on I think we're now on to nearly 50 questions. Stephen, just remind us all, your email address is stephen.hale@adelaide.edu.au. Is that right?
It is, but if you've got some way of copying and pasting those questions that's not too time consuming for, just send them to me. And if you've got somewhere where you can publish them, within a day or two, I'll answer them.
Absolutely, terrific. I'm really looking forward to seeing Stephanie's book when it comes out. As I've been saying to a number of microeconomists, I don't know, for whatever reason, maybe it is, I've noticed that financial economists get their heads around this quicker, and I also have a feeling that microeconomists get their heads around it quicker perhaps than neoclassically trained macroeconomists, because essentially, all you're essentially saying is that we've essentially just got to refocus on real resource scarcity and the basic rules of, so in your answer about Zimbabwe and hyperinflation, what you're really talking about is basic supply and demand. If the supply isn't there, then it doesn't matter whether you can create your own currency and you can artificially create demand or not. Then what matters is what are the aggregate supply constraints, and that is essentially really just very basic on one level. And don't tell Bill Mitchell and Stephanie Kelton this, but on one level they're really talking about a reconsideration and a reapplication of classical microeconomics in a modern post-gold standard era without perhaps a lot of the sort of gold standard era fixed exchange rate trappings that have built up around modern macroeconomics. They're really talking about the relationship between aggregate demand and aggregate supply in a world where the currency sovereign in demand that's denominated in dollars has a kind of infinitely elastic aggregate demand curve. I mean, it's kind of, I find it fascinating. So many economists, when they encounter the core literature, say, this is just...
before we finish...
This is basic economics, yeah.
Before we finish, if there are any economists listening, then I strongly recommend getting hold of Wynne Godley and Mark Lavoie's book and working your way through the macroeconomic models. There's someone called Gennaro Zezza has produced eViews versions, which are freely available, and you can, it basically takes you to more and more sophisticated, more and more realistic versions of monetary systems. And by the time you get to the last couple of chapters, you really have a detailed understanding of how stock flow consistent macroeconomics works. And many of the things we've been talking about then just fall out of the model. What I was talking about as far as surpluses being unsustainable, deficits being necessary. You can't grow the economy indefinitely if you don't have a trade surplus, and not everyone can have a trade surplus unless you run a fiscal deficit. So under those circumstances, why would you want to try and run a fiscal surplus? Unless it's necessary to manage inflation, there is no other reason for a monetary sovereign government ever to aim for a fiscal surplus.
All right. Terrific. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks everyone. And we'll make sure that the recording is available. And Stephen, I'll get those questions on notice to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks
for your
time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Cheers.
Bye.
Stay well. Bye.
You too.